Master, Mr. Chairman, Professor Stanton, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's lovely to see so many of you here. For the benefit of those of you who have not attended Butchers Hall before, I just have a few announcements for you. And firstly, and most importantly, emergency exits, ladies and gentlemen. We have two in this room. They're clearly marked by the green lights above the doors to the right there. And in the unlikely event we do have to evacuate this room, can I ask you just to move in an orderly manner? Thank you very much for that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our agenda this evening has several moving parts. First of all, we will have an address from our speaker, Professor Stanton. Then it will be followed by a panel session. And during that time, if questions are invited from the floor, can I ask you to kindly raise your hand. A microphone will be brought to you. Pose your question, but please pass the microphone straight back to the person that gave it to you. Thank you for that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, following tonight's agenda up here, there will be a lovely buffet for you, and that will be situated on 2 floors. So if I can ask at the end of the proceedings here, for all the people here to my left to kindly make their way straight down to the ground floor reception where the buffet will be served. And once all these people disappear, can I kindly ask all the people to the right of the aisle there to make their way down to the court suite on the 1st floor where your buffet will be served. Incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, don't worry. Once you've got your food and you've had your food, you can mingle on either level you want to. Mingle or whatever, I know. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, during that period when you're having the buffet and drinks, etc., there will be video interviews taking place, so just be aware of that. And before I introduce our master, I'd just like to say, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, am I the only one that got the memo about the dress code this evening? Right now, can I ask you to please give a very warm welcome to your host this evening, the master of the Worshipful Company of Butchers, Andrew Parker.
Good evening and welcome to Butchers Hall, and welcome to the 2nd annual Meat Lecture. It's nice to see a packed room again following on from last year, and it was great that we sold out a few weeks ago, so it's a hot ticket tonight. I need to give some thanks for making tonight possible, because without these people we would not be having this lecture. I need to give a massive thanks to the Industry Engagement Working Group for organising tonight's lecture, and I need to give a massive thank to the staff, both Jeff and Carla, for getting it on tonight. I also need to thank our panellists, Jayne Buxton, Judith Batchelar and John Powell, for giving their time to talk to us this evening. I also need to thank our main speaker, Professor Alice Stanton, for again giving her time to come over and address us this evening. Last but by no means least, I also need to thank our chairman, Stuart Roberts, who once again has given his time to host this evening. So thank you very much, all of you, for giving your time for this evening. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Stuart, who will take us through the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Master, and I couldn't agree more. It's fantastic to see so many people in the room. You may remember when I was chairing this last year, I used the fact that my shoulder was broken to break the dress code, so I didn't have to wear a jacket. So I thought I'd stick with that, and it's great so many have joined me, and thank you for pointing that out, Beadle. I am now going to make it a tradition that at this event I will never wear a jacket. This is the 2nd annual City Meat Lecture. We called last year's one the 1st annual Meat Lecture. I'm not sure we could have called it the annual one at that stage, but we certainly can now. And it was incredibly successful. But one of the things that I would like to change this year, and apologies, Rachel, I haven't highlighted this to the organisers. I think last year I asked too many questions. So I am determined this year I will ask one question only. So Beadle, your point about If people want to ask a question, personally I'm going to say they have to ask a question, otherwise dinner won't be ready in time. So please be prepared to ask your questions. One of the other things it's great to see, and I think this was the case last year, but even more so this year, it is a very different audience in the room in many cases to those that we normally see in this room. It is fantastic to see so many youngsters in the room as well, and I will give preferential treatment to anyone who is younger than me to ask a question. Now, if I did that in one of the normal events we have here, I suspect there would be 2 questions and not a lot else. This evening, there can be many. Now, I'm going to move on. With these lectures, we have always tried to pick apart, certainly in our thinking, the big issues facing the meat industry. We probably, as an industry, spend a disproportionate amount of time discussing one of the threats that we face, and that is the lecture we had last year on the environmental impacts of meat consumption, meat production. I'm sure that will come up this evening, but too often we forget what meat is. It is food. What is food about? Food is nutrition. That's why we have food. And arguably, there is nothing more important to humans than nutrition. And personally, I was delighted when the organising committee decided this year that we would invite Alice Stanton. I've been very lucky. I have heard Alice speak on a number of occasions. And on every single occasion, I have learned something new. That is not because, Alice, you are poor at getting the message across. It's because I struggle to comprehend it all in the speed of time I need to. So please, feel free to take notes. Feel free to put them on social media, and feel free to get actively involved. I genuinely believe there is no one who is better equipped to talk about this subject and the importance of meat in a human diet than Professor Stanton. For those of you who don't know, or for those who've been too lazy to read the booklet that was sat on your chair, Professor Stanton is a professor of cardiovascular pharmacology. Now, I got it at the second attempt, which is probably not bad, at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. She's also the Director of Human Health at Devonish Foods, and it's lovely to have Owen with us from Devonish as well this evening. Professor Stanton has delivered numerous lectures on this subject, some amongst challenging audiences, some amongst very receptive and very positive audiences, and I very much hope that's what you will receive this evening. For me, you really changed my thinking on this when you gave the very important science lecture at the Oxford Farming Conference back in 2020. And the whole industry, by the end of this evening, I hope will understand why I believe we all owe you a huge debt of gratitude. I will also challenge everyone in the room to take away what Alice has said and to magnify it, to energize it, and to use what she is about to equip you with. So, Alice, it is a delight to share a panel with you this evening. It is a delight to listen to you once more. So can I please welcome you up for your lecture?
Wow, to follow that. So thank you very much, Stuart. Master, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here with you this evening to discuss some very important topics to all of us in the room, but actually further afield to the whole world. So the title is, How Much Red Meat Should We Eat? And also to consider, if we go too extreme on environmental boundaries or issues, are there unforeseen dangers for human health? So we need to consider the whole system. And I'm looking for a discussion. So I'm not telling you what it is, but I'm giving you my view, and I'd love to discuss it with you. yeah, I have a number of disclosures. I'm a working physician, an active scientist, and I'm an employee and stockholder of Definition Nutrition. I'm an omnivore. I eat lots of fruit and vegetables, as well as animal source foods. I'm going to start with what is a healthy diet? And this is the WHO definition, and I think it's really good. A healthy diet needs to do at least two things. It needs to protect against malnutrition in all its forms, but it also needs to protect against the diseases of excess. So the chronic, non-communicable diseases, the cancers, the heart attacks, the strokes, diabetes mellitus. And we're really not doing very well here. Almost 2 billion of the 8 billion of us are either overweight or obese, and therefore are at risk of non-communicable diseases. What is an absolute shame on us is that almost 1 billion are chronically undernourished, and that's that they don't get enough calories so that when they go to bed, they are feeling satiated. They go to bed hungry most nights, and their children do too. That is a shame on all of us. What is less well recognized is that at least 2 billion, and actually it's more, it's probably 4 billion of us, suffer from hidden hunger. We have enough calories, but the quality of our diet is inadequate. So we don't eat quality protein containing enough of the essential amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. We don't eat enough long-chain omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, which traditionally come from oily fish. And we don't get enough vitamins and minerals, such as B12, vitamin A, vitamin D, iron, iodine, selenium, zinc. They are all the key nutrients that are commonly deficient in the 4 billion of us who are deficient. Most of those are derived solely from animal source foods or are best got from animal source foods. And this is illustrated by this slide here. So on the left, we see animal source foods, we see the list of foods and that are rich in the various vitamins and minerals. Of the top 20 foods that are rich for these commonly deficient nutrients, 18 are animal source foods. On your right, you can see if the percent on the horizontal axis of both of those panels, it's the percentage of calories that come from animal source foods. If 30% or 1/3 of your calories come from animal source foods, you are very unlikely to be deficient in the vitamins in the middle panel or in key minerals such as calcium, iron, phosphorus, and zinc. If 30%, so 1/3 of your calories come from animal source foods. If less come from animal source foods, you get increasing levels of deficiency. They're levels, blood levels and food levels of vitamins and minerals. But let's look at a real endpoint, childhood stunting. And childhood stunting is not just small children. That's children that are damaged both physically and cognitively. Their brains have not developed sufficiently. They perform or achieve less well in school. Lesser career options, lesser earning potential, and then you get a vicious circle because they're less able to provide for their children. The pink-colored countries, sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia, have a prevalence of greater than 30% childhood stunting. So 1 in 3 children are stunted. That is a shame. They're the exact same countries that eat the least meat, that drink the least milk, and that eat the least seafood. Now, I don't want, as a physician, for climate chaos to occur, because there would be disastrous consequences for human health. Heat and extreme weather events, floods, forest fires, droughts and desertification, endangering food security, more diseases such as vector-borne mosquito diseases such as malaria extending further northwards into the global north, and increased poverty, inequality, prompting violence and migration. So we will not escape in the rich north from the consequences of climate chaos in the global south. So I don't want climate change to occur from any of our points of view, and neither do you. So I very much welcomed the start of the discussion that we needed to balance food production with planetary boundaries. And one of the first was the EATLancet Commission reference diet, and I'm sure everyone in the room has heard of it. It recommended a doubling of intakes of fruit and vegetables, nuts, seeds, and legumes. And I can't argue with it. In fact, I agree with that. So hands up, everyone in the room that eats 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day. Okay? Are you going to move to 10 portions a day? Hands up who's going to move to 10 portions a day, because that's what the EATLancet reference diet recommends. And I'm not sure there's much evidence for it. We need to go to about 5 portions. We're not doing it. They also recommended a halving of meat and dairy intakes. They said that adoption of their diet, so moving from the Eat Well guide to the EATLancet reference diet, that would save 11 million deaths annually from chronic diseases, cancers, heart attacks, and strokes. And yet, that is what the prediction is. But it would come from the increase in fruit and vegetables, the reduction in calories, the reduction in salt. It wouldn't come from the halving of meat and dairy, because excessive consumption of red meat, by their calculations, was only causing 25,000 deaths. So a tiny part of the 11 million if you prevented all of those 25,000 deaths. And halving of dairy, as I'll show you, would actually increase cancer, heart attacks, and strokes. There was no consideration of the nutritional deficiencies that would occur if we all adopted the EATLancet reference diet. Despite that being very exhaustively discussed in the media, in the general public, there actually has been a wealth of further publications recommending either dramatic reductions or indeed exclusion of animal source foods from the diet. So this publication here on the right-hand side said, every single Frankfurter that you eat is taking away 35 minutes of your life. So how many have you eaten in the last month? This publication said, exclude red meat and processed meat, and men will live 4 years longer, and women 3 years longer. Why are men getting more? They actually have a shorter lifespan than us anyway. But so it's equaling it up. This is just not credible. There's no evidence for that. We're going to focus in on one publication, the one that was on the top left, the Global Burden of Disease Study. And the reason we're going to do it is that all of the other publications either use the data from the Global Burden of Disease collaborators or they use the same method of analysis. It's also because they are the most influential data producers in the world. So it's their data and analysis that are quoted by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, of the WHO. The European Commission Farm to Fork strategy also use their data. Your National Food Strategy for England also used their data. And EATLancet Commission actually used their data. They're not shy. The Global Burden Disease Collaborators, their leader, Professor Christopher Murray, recently self-described the global burden disease studies as the de facto source for global health accounting. So if they are that important and they maintain the accounts for global health, they need to be accurate and they need to be evidence-based. Are they? So we'll have a look at their data. What I've shown here, and it's a busy slide, but I'm going to explain it, they're both their 2017 and their 2019 analysis. They produce major reports every 2 years. The 2017 analysis is shown by the blue column, the 2019 analysis by the red columns. And you can see excesses cause a fair number of deaths, but actually more deaths are caused by deficiencies towards the bottom of the panel. The big excesses are high body mass index, or diets high in calories, and salt excess. Really, the others are minor by comparison. The big deficiencies are child and maternal malnutrition, particularly if it results in childhood stunting. We're only showing the deaths here, but there's another measure called DALYs, which is disability-adjusted life years, which is a measure of illnesses that cause misery and illness without causing death. And in actual fact, if we saw that, the major difference would be that child and maternal malnutrition relatively will be twice as long. Really important for causing misery and lives lived suboptimally. Other important deficiencies are diets low in grains, and then diets low in fruits, nuts, seeds, vegetables, and one of my own favorites, seafood, omega-3 fatty acids. Diets low in milk actually cause deaths. Both the 2017 and the 2019 analysis show that, but they're also underestimates because they only counted the protection afforded by dairy to colon cancer. You can see here that most of the world consume less than 1 helping a day of dairy. That's of milk, yogurt, cheese, butter. Yet, up to 900 mLs of milk, so at least 3 helpings of milk, gives increasing protection against colorectal cancer. Not mentioned at all in the global burden of disease statistics was the protection against heart attacks and strokes. This comes from the PURE study, the prospective or urban cohorts, a rural epidemiology study, conducted in 21 countries worldwide, low-income countries, medium-income countries, and high-income countries. And what you can see here is that if you are consuming at least 2 servings a day of dairy, compared with less than a half a serving a day, you were 32% less likely to have a heart attack or stroke, and you were 25% less likely to actually die. Now, this is from self-reported intake of dairy, but we can back that up with a study which actually measured blood levels of a biomarker of dairy intake. So it measured serum pentadecanoic acid, which only comes from dairy. So therefore, that's a measure of how much dairy you're eating. And again, the higher that marker, the lower the cardiovascular events. What I'm going to focus on for a little while are the data that came from the Global Burden of Disease 2019, when they said that excessive red meat consumption was not causing 25,000 deaths, it was causing almost 900,000 deaths. An increase, 36-fold increase in the number of deaths attributed to red meat. Now, you would think for that increase, you would need new evidence, and that would need to be presented to justify that change in estimates. So that's almost 1 million deaths being caused by red meat. They produced no evidence whatsoever for that change in estimate. They did say, we've done new systematic reviews and meta-regressions. No, they're not published. Well, they didn't say that, but they aren't published. No one has seen them. And we found sufficient evidence saying that red meat, increasing intake of red meat, causes heart attacks, causes the 2 types of strokes, ischemic stroke and hemorrhagic stroke, causes breast cancer in addition to colorectal cancer and diabetes mellitus. And all of these relationships are highly statistically significant because you can see that the vertical lines here don't include a relative risk of 1. So that means it is very clear that there is a definite relationship. This is not due to chance. But they didn't produce any evidence. They added up all the deaths caused, the heart attack deaths, the stroke deaths, the cancer deaths, the diabetes mellitus deaths. And they said, this is actually the relationship between red meat intake on the horizontal axis and relative risk of death. So from the first mouthful, so from 5 grams a day, which would give you 35 grams a week, I think that'll be a steak a month. In actual fact, you are at increased risk of death, and if you eat more, you're at even more increased risk of death. This is the relevant interval for red meat intake, because actually the vast majority of the world are consuming less than or equal to 75 grams a day. The UK average is about 30 grams a day currently. This is what the real data shows. So this is from the 10 largest published cohort studies about the relationship between red meat intake and risk of death. So this comes from the PURE study, which is a global study, covers the whole world. Then there's 2 European studies, Asian studies, and North American studies. No study shows an increased risk under 25 grams a day. The global study, the European studies, and the Asian studies either show no risk whatsoever at any dose or only show it at above 75 grams a day. 2 of the North American studies do show, 2 out of 3 do show a rising risk from 25 grams a day to 75 grams a day. Because of our concerns about the disparity between the Global Burden of Disease 2019 analysis and what we could see in the medical literature, 6 of us got together, 6 professors from 6 different universities, from Ireland, from the UK, from Belgium, and from Australia. And we wrote a letter to the Lancet. We did that in March of 2021. Sorry, May of 2021. We first of all were refused publication of our letter and we got no answers to our questions. 6 months later in November, we got an apology from the Lancet and they said, we were prompted by some journalists as to why we weren't answering your questions, and actually we were really sorry. And we, the senior correspondence editor and also the editor-in-chief, have re-looked at your letter, and actually you make very valid points and we will publish your letter. It still took another 3 months before we got it published in February of this year. We asked 2 key questions. So where's the evidence? Where are the peer-reviewed publications of their updated or new systematic reviews, which are published in accordance with the journal's guidance, which is two things called the PRISMA statement and the Gather statement. Interestingly, Christopher Murray, the lead author of the Global Burden of Disease Studies, and Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of the Lancet, are actually authors of the Gather statement, which is the guide for how you report global health estimates. So they disobeyed their own guidance. Where's the evidence for changing the optimal intake of red meat, or the red meat intake that causes no problems, called the theoretical minimum risk exposure level, the TMREL, for moving it from 22.5 grams a day to 0? And what about all the other additional deaths and illnesses that would occur from iron deficiency anemia, elderly fragility, and poor maternal nutrition if we excluded red meat from the diet, which is what is intended by a red meat TMREL of 0? A month after our letter was published, and in further correspondence, we got some answers. We got an admission of errors. Actually, there's a clear protective relationship between red meat and hemorrhagic stroke. That's different from a statistically significant adverse effect of red meat on hemorrhagic stroke. There's no evidence supporting a relationship between red meat consumption and subarachnoid hemorrhage. The strength of evidence regarding any of these endpoints on red meat is relatively weak. We were wrong to set the TMREL of red meat to 0. And they said, well, we'll do that better in our next reports. That's not good enough. The rules are, if you have confirmed errors, you must immediately publish a correction. They still haven't answered our key questions. They hadn't given us the systematic reviews, and they actually made it clear that they actually weren't going to count any deaths or illnesses from malnutrition. We were joined in August of this year, and we were delighted that these two august bodies, the Academy of Nutrition Sciences and the World Cancer Research Fund, and the World Cancer Research Fund really are the accounting authority for risk factors for cancer. They're hugely important. And they use statements like, we support Stanton and colleagues, need for further clarification, justification, or reconsideration of the optimal intake of red meat of 0. They use terms like implausible, lack of transparency, and undermines the authority of all global health or global burden of disease estimates. Troublesome, unsupported by the evidence, unrealistic. And neither the World Cancer Research Fund nor any other international organization are recommending complete avoidance of meat. We also got considerable media and scientific interest from the specialist agri-food journalists, but also from the broadsheets, and a lot of social media activity. I'm just going to highlight one in the bottom right-hand corner there from Gordon Guyatt. What he says is, now Gordon Guyatt is a professor from McMaster University and is one of the founders of evidence-based medicine, because we don't practice medicine on opinion anymore. We practice it based on facts and evidence. What he said was, calls for evidence remain unanswered, even in latest author's response. Big problem. Lo and behold, 5 weeks ago, Global Burden of Disease collaborators published a series of articles in Nature Medicine. And the one concerning red meat included the systematic reviews for red meat and heart attacks, strokes, and cancers. And instead of there being statistically significant relationships for all 6 of these, 5 are not statistically significant. So therefore, no evidence for heart attacks, for hemorrhagic stroke, for ischemic stroke, for breast cancer, or for diabetes mellitus. Only the one for colorectal cancer remains statistically significant. And even that is doubtful when you look at the actual analysis. There are technical flaws with it which make it implausible. They summarized that by a weak association with colorectal cancer, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes mellitus, and ischemic heart disease. But actually, a non-statistically significant relationship is no evidence. They still awarded all 4 of those endpoints 2 stars. That suggests that there's something going on. They did say no evidence, and this is in the summary, so right up front, no evidence of an association between unprocessed red meat and ischemic stroke or hemorrhagic stroke, but they still gave it 1 star. That's amazing. I do agree with what else was in the summary. They've said, actually, for the TMREL, it could be anywhere between 0 and 200 grams. So that means that actually the optimal intake of unprocessed red meat could be as high as 200 grams per day. Now, I'm not actually advising 200 grams a day. That would be a large steak every day, and no, that's, for lots of reasons, that's not a good idea. That would be an unbalanced diet. But we don't know. It's such a flat relationship. They said the evidence that eating unprocessed red meat is associated with increased risk of disease is weak, and it's insufficient to make any strong or conclusive recommendations. Now, they still haven't corrected the original article in the Lancet. And that's problematic because in the National Food Strategy for England, in the evidence document, there are a number of slides which quote the Global Burden of Disease 2019 analysis. And what I'm just highlighting here is, using Global Burden of Disease 2019 data, it suggests that diet high in red meat are causing twice the DALYs as diets high in salt. And that's just not credible. It's not right for anyone who works. I've worked in the field of salt avoidance for the last 30 years. Salt, excess of salt is bad for you. It's clearly bad for you. It certainly is causing more deaths and more illnesses than excessive red meat. The Lancet are still publishing articles, very influential articles, that use the Global Burden of Disease 2019 analysis and use a TMREL of 0 to justify their estimates. So this Lancet Countdown report, just published 4 weeks ago, said 11 million deaths are attributable to imbalanced diet, of which 2 million are related to red and processed meat and dairy consumption. So there's a perpetuation of the rumors because no corrections have been applied to the Global Burden of Disease 2019 analysis. And that influences both governmental bodies and non-governmental bodies. Such misinformation may be misleading people who have very strong ambitions to reduce human misery and to save the planet. So I'm totally in agreement with the WWF's ambition, which is their overall ambition is to halve the environmental impact of UK supermarkets baskets by 2030. And they're working in absolutely the right areas, in climate, in deforestation, in diets, in agriculture, marine, waste, and packaging. I'm going to just focus on diets because that's my area of expertise. I'm also going to say a word about their ambitions for diets may actually have a perverse effect on reduction of agricultural emissions, which are really, really important. The key outcome for diets that the WWF have chosen is that 50% of all protein sales, 50% should be from plant source foods and 50% from animal source foods. We're currently at about 5% from plant-based foods. So that is a massive change. They say that their main targets in diet and how they will achieve the 50-50 plant-animal protein split will be to reduce UK's biomass consumption footprint by 50%. And that will entail a reduction of consumption of meat and dairy by at least 20%. And an increase in the proportion of plant-based foods in the average diet. And the way that that might be achieved includes these actions. So supporting customers to make choices that are more aligned with the Live Well diet, which is the diet recommended by the WWF. And we'll look at that more closely in a minute. Use nudges such as put plant-based alternatives on priority shelf space. So this is all directed at the retailers so that they can achieve the 50-50 plant-animal protein split. Reduce or remove price promotions from meat products and reduce advertising on spend on meat and dairy produce. So the Live Well principles actually are very admirable. The overall principles: eat more plants, eat a variety of foods, waste less food, moderate your meat consumption, both red and white, buy foods that meet a credible certified standard so that they're produced as sustainably as possible, so that we're heading in a sustainable direction. Eat fewer foods high in fat, salt, and sugar. Now, this is the breakdown of the current UK diet, and then to the bottom is what the Live Well diet would have us eat for adults. Plant protein is to increase from 13 grams a day on average to 33. And animal protein is to reduce from 124 down to 81. Dairy actually isn't to change. Well, go from 193 mLs or grams to 192. But they said actually that dairy was to reduce by 20%. So that's a puzzle. And plant dairy, so the plant alternatives for dairy, are to remain at 3 mLs a day on average. Looking at that in more detail, actually, sorry, that actually isn't a 50-50 split. Because if you count up the grams, actually, it's only for meat and meat alternatives, it's a 29 to 71% split. And for the plant dairy versus animal dairy split, it's a 2% versus 98%. So in order for us to achieve a 50-50 split, we have to go far further than the Live Well plate. And the Live Well plate requires some pretty dramatic changes when you look at it by individual food. So legumes, nuts, and seeds need to increase almost by threefold, so 155% change. Likewise, meat replaces, but they're starting from a very low base there of 2 grams per day up to 5. But the legumes, nuts, and seeds is substantial. Note that fish, particularly fish aquaculture, has to increase. This is because for nutritional adequacy, this ensures that you're getting enough protein but also you're getting the key omega-3 fatty acids. So they're keeping that actually we should be eating 2 portions of fish per week, one of which should be oily fish, in order to ensure we get enough omega-3. That results in even greater reductions in the other meat products. So beef and veal has to go down by 78%. Poultry actually has to go down by 70%. And processed meat by 60%, cheese by 60%. But that's if we're doing the 30-70 split according to the LiveWell plate. But if we have to go to the 50-50 plate, there actually will be required even greater reductions in those meat and cheese products, and greater increases in legumes, nuts, and oilseeds. So I'm just going to have a look at what are the implications of those changes. What would be the potential impact of such meat reductions on iron deficiency anemia? Now, iron deficiency is not just prevalent in low-income countries. The UK has a problem. The latest figures show that 31% of UK preschool-age children are iron deficient, and 21% of women of childbearing age are iron deficient. On the right-hand side is the relationship between meat intake and iron deficiency anemia. Total meat intake, and then broken down by red meat, processed meat, and poultry. This comes from the UK Biobank study, so it's recent data. And you can see, if you just look at the middle panel, total meat intake, the more meat that you eat, up to 120 grams a day, the more protected you are from iron deficiency anemia. And this probably comes from contributions from red meat, processed meat, and poultry, because you see the same relationship when you actually look at each of those by themselves. What about the impact of such reductions on school-going children, both on physical performance and cognitively? Now, we don't have an experiment like that. We've never done this where we've taken meat out of the diet for whole populations. But we've done the reverse. We've gone into Africa and done a really good study in Kenya, where they took 12 schools, primary schools. They randomized them for 2 years, for 5 semesters, to different eating programs, to feed, getting additional school meals during the school day when the children came to school. One group got a plain vegetable stew each day. One group got the vegetable stew plus milk. One group got the vegetable stew with meat incorporated. And one group actually got no additional feeding, which was a pity. The 3 groups that got additional food all got the same additional calories, but very different protein, available iron, available zinc, B12, and calcium, favoring the meat and milk groups. And they looked at how well they performed. Now, after the 5 months, the meat and dairy groups were physically stronger, they were taller. But what was really important was looking at their school achievements. And they looked at 5 different subjects, so English, arithmetic, 2 national languages, which I can't pronounce, geography, science, and the arts. And they compared the performance of the 4 groups. And right over on the far right-hand side, you can see the average scores across those 7 subjects. The meat and the milk group, by comparison with the two control groups, were 17% and 13% on average higher. For whole classes, that is absolutely huge. That's a huge difference. So do we want to reduce the performance of our primary school children by such percentages, by omission of meat and probably dairy from their diet, or dramatic reductions? People who eat meat and animal source foods live longer. These are two 2022 studies just published in the last few months. We need to consider what are the plant-based alternative foods that we are recommending to replace meat and dairy, if that's the route that we go along. Now, the currently available plant-based alternatives are ultra-processed foods. They're very high in added sugars, salt, and multiple cosmetic additives. So Beyond Meat Burger does have the same protein content on average, possibly not the same protein quality as a steak. It has 5 times the salt. Jackfruit and mushroom products are even worse. Much more sugar and salt, multiple additives, and typically about 20% of the protein. Unsweetened almond milk, twice the salt, 1/8 the protein, and 1/4 the zinc. You certainly don't want to be feeding this to your 3-year-old child because it's not adequate. It's not an adequate replacement for a glass of milk. Stephen Van Fleet from Duke University has looked at the difference between plant-based alternatives and meat and dairy. And what he says is the mimicking of animal foods using isolated plant proteins, fats, minerals, and vitamins likely underestimates the true nutritional complexity of whole foods, because it's not just the 30 ingredients that we currently measure. There's thousands of bioactive chemicals in foods. We cannot currently replicate those exactly. So novel plant-based meat and dairy alternatives should arguably be treated as alternatives in terms of sensory experience, so taste and enjoyment, but not as true replacements in terms of nutrition. My penultimate slide. Are there perverse outcomes for production agriculture? So we at the Devonish Lancet Doubt have achieved net zero. The carbon emissions from our ruminants, from beef and lamb, co-grazing on pasture, are more than offset by carbon sequestered by the landscape. So we're actually sequestering more carbon than we're emitting. We've done that mainly through a combination of a soil improvement program and multi-species swards. There are multiple other additional tools that can be added to that: better genetics, methane inhibitors, silvopasture. We need that innovation to happen, but we also need our farming community and the agri-food sector to promote take-up of these innovations and these changes. If we reduce the market, the meat market, and possibly the dairy market by 75% plus, if we're going to get the 50-50 split, if we stop advertisement of sustainably produced animal source foods, will we get uptake of those innovations and those improvements in sustainability? Will we reduce agriculture emissions if we follow the 50-50 split? So it's clear that animal source foods are nutrient-rich foods. The relationship between red meat and disease burden in my view, is J-shaped. That means that if we eat too little, that's strongly associated with nutritional deficiency illnesses. There is low certainty evidence that an excess of red meat and processed meat can cause cancers, colorectal cancer in particular, but that's above 75 grams a day, and we're not recommending that. In actual fact, the world is not eating enough dairy or enough long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. Policymakers, I hope I've convinced you that it is really important that scientists, the general public, but particularly policymakers, should be extremely wary of global health estimates that are not rigorously and transparently evidence-based, or that ignore the protections against nutritional deficiencies afforded by animal source foods. I absolutely admire the overall ambition of the World Wildlife Fund Basket Initiative, the halving of the environmental impact of UK supermarkets by 2030. That's absolutely right. However, if we follow a 50-50 plant-animal protein sales split, that will result in substantial nutritional deficiencies, and it's women, children, and the elderly who will suffer most, alongside those of low income. Particularly if our animal source foods are replaced by ultra-processed plant-based alternatives, there's an even greater risk of the diseases of chronic non-communicable diseases, heart attacks, strokes, diabetes mellitus, and cancers. Thank you for your attention.
Like most times I've heard you, Alice, I don't really know where to start. It really is a tour de force, and thank you. And if there is anyone in the room who has not had a message to take home with them, they've clearly been listening to something different to what I was. Now it's your chance to discuss the issues, to raise any questions around the issues. Feel free to challenge, if you're brave, challenge Alice on what she's had to say. But we're also joined by an excellent panel. I think last year the panel session really brought things to life. And I'm delighted this year with the panel we've got. So the first thing for me is we can read science, we can listen to science. But actually it's important to get that message across to a wider audience, to use language that is not necessarily scientific language, but language that others could relate to. And I'm delighted that our first panelist has done that in spades. So Jayne Buxton, could you please come and join us? Jayne is a journalist and author with previous experience as a management consultant and entrepreneur, but is known to this industry and to many, many other people as the author of several books. The most important one recently is The Great Plant-Based Con: Why Eating a Plant-Only Diet Won't Improve Your Health or Save the Planet. So thank you, Jayne, and it's great you could join us. Next, we've got John Powell. John has been head of agricultural sectors team at Defra since March 2020. He's worked in a combination of MAF and Defra, I think, since the mid-80s. And then had a very interesting spell for thick end of 20 years, I think, advising a number of EU candidate countries on what they needed to put in place in terms of their agricultural policies and their institutions. So, John, it's great to have you with us as well. And finally, I don't particularly think she needs much of an introduction. She is known to many, many of us here. But I'm delighted that we have another liveryman on the panel, and that's Judith Batchelar. For anyone in the room who doesn't know Judith, she is a biochemist and nutritionist by background. She was a former director at Sainsbury's. She's deputy chair of the Environment Agency. She sits on many, many panels and boards, including, I think, the Rugby Players Association, and we're in front of the Select Committee this afternoon, possibly getting a slightly easier ride than the RFU representative or the Premier League representative got in the piece I saw. Judith, it's fantastic to have you join us. I'm going to join the panel in a second, just because I can't be bothered to stand up here for too long. But what I want to start off with is a very open question. This is the only question I'm going to ask, okay? And I'd just like each of John, Jayne, and Judith to just give us their reflections, a couple of minutes at most, on what Alice has just had to say. What is your take-home message from that? And we'll start with you, Judith.
Oh, thank you. Could everybody hear me? Brilliant, thank you. I think, well, first of all, thank you, Alice. As always, just brilliant to listen to you. I always say to Alice that she's got the most beautiful voice, and I could listen to her for hours, but also she says really good things, so thank you. I think it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, that's the first thing. And I suppose the second thing is it's a global issue. So if you think about it at a macro level, the world doesn't produce what the world needs to be eating. And we might talk about the nuances of the Eat Well Guide, the Live Well Plate, all sorts of different national dietary guidelines that exist, and there are hundreds of them all around the world. But fundamentally, depending where you live, some people need to eat more dairy, some people need to eat less, some people need to eat more meat, some people need to eat less. And from a consumer point of view, it's unbelievably difficult to work your way through all of that. They always say, if you ask a nutritionist, what should I eat? They always start the answer with, it depends. And it does depend. It depends whether you're in the first 1,000 days of life or in the last 1,000 days of life. It depends whether you're a pregnant woman or an elite sportsman. So I think the challenge for me is, how do you get the policymakers, and I call them the push, to agree on policy that means that consumers at the pull end of this can make the right decisions, and that we make it easy for consumers to make the right choices. And one of the challenges that we've got is that with lots of different views on what that perfect diet should be like, we miss the point, which is we are a million miles away from where we need to be. So any move in the right direction in this country would be a good thing. I think we all know what the direction of that is. So I think my question is a question to all of you is, why aren't we doing anything about it? So thank you, Stuart.
If it's okay, Judith, I won't give 180 people the opportunity to answer the question. Jayne, what do you take home from Alice's presentation?
Well, so much, because you covered an immense number of important points, but I'd like to build on just a couple of them. Oh, that went up loud. And also build on what you have just said about it depends. Because there's recently been another study done which very much supports what Alice was revealing about the implications of moving to 50-50 plant-based animal source proteins. A study was conducted in France by French researchers on a French cohort. There's no reason why it wouldn't apply in principle other places. And what they discovered was that the 50-50 plant-animal food protein split is the bare minimum in terms of animal source foods that you need to get adequate nutrition across the board. But for some groups, it's inadequate in terms of animal source foods. So for older people, men and women over 65, and for women under 50, they require between 50 and 65% of their protein to be animal source foods. So this should make it clear that there is no one-size-fits-all protein requirement or amount of meat that we should eat every day. And that's why the blunt instrument that we hear so often, we all must eat less meat, is just that. It's a blunt instrument, and it's not going to help those over 65s. It's not going to help the young women. It's not going to help the kids, as you saw in that Kenyan example. A second point I wanted to make was about the GBD, Global Burden of Disease reporting. And again, that's an incredibly important issue, but I wanted to reiterate how important that is for everyday consumers of food and nutrition information. So we might, some of us, think, well, that's just a report that feeds into other reports, and that's discussed at a high level for policy, but it doesn't really affect what real people do. But then you have to remember that that report and that red meat requirement of 0, by the way, upper limit of 0, has been cited about 800 times or more probably by now. And I caught it one weekend when I was reading the Times newspaper. It was used as a basis for a longevity calculator, which was being marketed to the likes of us to get us to adjust our diet so that we would live longer. And this is a catchy little gadget that somebody hopes to make a lot of money off. More importantly, it's probably going to make its way into the market and influence a lot of people's decisions about what they eat. And that is based on the 0 intake of red meat. So if ever we are under the impression that these reports don't have much to do with what real people do or real people think about food, I think we're mistaken, and we need to be very careful and fight back on that.
Thank you, Jayne. And finally, John, we've had 2 responses already, both of which have actually mentioned the word policy in it. You know, you are a policy maker. You have been, you're a very experienced policy maker. What do you take away from what Alice told us?
First of all, can I echo Alice? Fantastic, thank you. And also thank you for the invite to be on this stage with this very dignified other panel members. What did I take away? As a policy maker, I did take away a lot. 3 E's, very briefly. Evidence, first of all, the importance of evidence to substantiate anything. If you don't have proper evidence, too much of what we hear, what we say, is based on hearsay or rumour or something that someone just makes up, as appears to be the case in even reputable studies. So the importance of evidence. Secondly, the importance of education. It's clear, as someone that makes policy, that we can be very caught up in the facts and the evidence, and a lot of what you said there is really quite specific and detailed. Most consumers would probably have no idea about any of the background to this, what nutrition is in practice. They'll buy food because A, they enjoy it, B, the cost, the price they pay, particularly at the moment. So I think there has to be something more about education and how we inform and educate consumers about why they should be eating in different ways, how that actually benefits them, and what that actually means to the way they live. Which means the final E, I'm going to slightly exaggerate, but is everyday application. Because unless we actually can translate this into the way that a consumer can actually apply it in everyday life, it's going to be all very good and theoretical. And actually, I think that's where the industry has a role to play in actually enabling consumers to better understand what it is they're eating, why they're eating it, and what other preferences or alternatives, or just the same diet but in a different way, that they would help them and benefit them. So.
Thanks, John. And I'm pretty sure that role, that responsibility around communication, I would be highly surprised if that doesn't come up in our questions. So I'm going to hand over to the audience now. There has been on social media, I see, some debate about what my age is and whether certain people are younger than me or not. So I'll be the judge of that, okay? But so if we don't have plenty of hands up, I will start picking on young people. But also, when you stand up with your question, can you also introduce yourself and any organisation you're representing if you are? So, Mike, we'll go to you in the middle. This is where I really embarrass myself. Now I've said that's Mike, everyone's going to expect me to know who their name is when they put their hand up.
Thank you, Stuart. Mike Gooding, representing myself. One One of the things that really struck me in the professor's presentation was I think there was just 6 of you who put your name to challenge the Lancet report. And then you showed a later slide which had, I don't know, 40 or 50 members of the science community putting their name to what doesn't seem to be very well evidence-based science. I wonder if the panel might like to speculate why so many of the science community seem to be prepared to put their name to what appears to be flawed science. Have they just not got the idea that we should be paying attention to sound evidence-based science? Or is the investment dollar perhaps more important?
Thank you, Mike. I'm not going to put every question to every panelist, okay? So I think certainly on that one, Alice, your interactions with other scientists, the challenge that Mike set down there, what's your views as to why there weren't more people sign up to yours in comparison to others?
Yeah, I would say that the Lancet Countdown does have about 100 authors. It covers a wide range of subjects. So the diet effects was only one segment of 5 big areas. A lot of the scientists who put their names to that report actually were covering other areas. There was probably only 3 or 4 who actually wrote about meat, dairy, and processed meat and their effects. We did contact a lot of scientists before we wrote the letter. And we did come across, both from scientists who are involved in the area and from other journals, that there's an issue of a backlash if they supported animal-sourced foods and their relationship with human health. From some younger scientists, there was a fear of getting further publications in prestigious journals, and there was a fear of losing grant funding, which actually messages were coming from university presidents, not in this continent, but in another not too distant continent. So there are pressures on scientists not to speak out in favor of animal-sourced foods. And I can actually absolutely understand it from some of the younger scientists. You will note that actually the 6 of us who signed up to it, most of us are Stuart's age or older.
Look, I am not in Pat Wall's age group, okay?
So we had nothing to lose. And Europe and Australia doesn't seem to have this pressure brought on its scientists. There appears to be more free speech.
Thanks. Where do we want to go next? Come on, don't be shy or I'm going to start picking on people. Yeah, gentleman here. Come on, David, hurry up.
Thank you. James Kiddo, butcher and grazier from Cornwall. I'm the 5th generation of our family butchers, and I supply the school that I went to, I supply the school that my father went to, and I supply the school that my children went to as well. We're very lucky that we've got that relationship with our local schools. There's probably other good butchers around the country as well that have the same repertoire with their education systems as well. But there are also a lot that aren't. And my thought or question to the panel really is, I like to think we're a bit of, for the meat job, we're ambassadors to try and promote our own local area and get it into the schools. Obviously, the problems we are having in the meat industry is the chefs or the cooks that we're dealing with are up against price and budget to do with the headmasters, mistresses, or academies, whoever's running the school. So they fight our corner a little bit to try and keep the red meat going into the school. Just going back to the slide with the child stunting and all the facts that explain why we need to have red meat in the diet. What can the government do, or what can we do to try and get more, or sustain the red meat into the schools and our education for the future generations that need this, probably more so than what we do?
Yeah.
Thank you. Judith, I'm going to come to you, partly because I can remember some discussions we had around, I think it was around the that one of the food strategy discussions we were having at one stage, and around that whole area around public procurement. Now, whether it be schools, whether it be prisons, whether it be hospitals, what are your thoughts around public procurement and shorter supply chains into those sort of establishments?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's an excellent question for a couple of reasons. One is school food standards, which you remember years ago, lots of people fought very hard for them, and people particularly still fight very hard for, people like Jamie Oliver. School food standards exist to ensure all of the things that we've just talked about happen, and that the investment in young people's diet and the quality of their diet is what it should be. That is there, the standard is there. Is it implemented? No, it isn't. So I think we have a big challenge between the gap between what we know, excuse me, and what is actually implemented in practice. So that's the first point. So there should never be an issue about young children in school getting what they need to get. The second issue is the whole piece around free school meals. Yeah. And do we really care enough about the early development of young people in this country? And whether that is the first 1,000 days, which we know if that first 1,000 days isn't good enough, those young people, through no fault of their own, never catch up, cognitively or physically. So, by the age of 2 years old, for them, it's pretty much mapped out. And that's all about things like Healthy Start vouchers. So, if you look at the business case for government to invest in Healthy Start vouchers and in free school meals, it is a no-brainer of a business case. And therefore, we should all be very active about why we think that that is important. The other thing, I think, with all of that is connecting producers to children in school. And some of you will be very aware of what LEAF have done with LEAF education and farmer time. 750 schools, I think over 60,000 children now. It's a phenomenal programme, because I think if you can create that interest in good food at a very early age, that is priceless, because those are things children take with them into later life. And then the second thing is, with my old supermarket hat on, there's very clear evidence that particularly in lower income families and lower income families with young children, if you provide very targeted incentives, i.e. things like 60p fruit and veg, or topping up Healthy Start vouchers but in a restricted way, it disproportionately affects the health of their basket in a good way, and those habits stay with those consumers. So, there's some reasons to be cheerful, but it does require a shift.
And I think that food is the absolute foundations of the education system. Absolutely. If we don't get it right, and the health system and everything else that goes with it. John, just on this, public procurement has been floating around this government and numerous governments before it. Where are we at the moment in terms of where Defra see the importance of public procurement, whether it be on the balance in the diet, or, importantly to this audience, the provenance of that product?
Obviously, public procurement is very important. It's a large expenditure. Schools, hospitals, prisons spend a lot of money on procurement of food. Obviously, the government is looking at the whole issue of public procurement at the moment, and there are a number of issues that have to be taken into account. One is the sheer scale of the food that's bought through it, the need to provide that choice, which can be sometimes and should be, where possible, sourced locally, but in other cases cannot always be sourced locally. And then there's the fact that these are also long-term contracts, so many of them are for a year or years, and it's not something you can turn around quickly and suddenly say, right, from tomorrow we're scrapping everything that's in force and we're going to recontract and you have to buy British. So, I mean, we are looking at it. It's very important. The government certainly wants to promote more local produce, and I think the suggestion Judith made, where you can, to link up with local schools and actually go in and talk to them about food. I do that. My wife's a teacher, and I go in to schools and I tell them about agriculture, and I'm amazed, to be honest, about sometimes just the sheer lack of understanding as to where food comes from and how important it is. So the more you can do to promote that, all well and good.
Great stuff, well done. Who's got the next question? Oh, we've now got a load of hands come up. So I'm going to go right at the very back. No, I'm not, because David's already walked here. Go on, David.
Hi, I've got a health journalism and nutrition background, and great talk, thank you very much. I've always been aware of the way that science has been quite compromised, what with funding, and I think you would agree that we're up against primary objectives around economics, especially with supermarkets. That's their primary objective, and I've noticed there's been a big push towards plant-based diets because it's cheaper to fulfill on, it's cheaper to push out plant-based burgers, etc. It seems to be a big thing. And we're also up against the massive big food industry, the way they lobby the government, and all the advertising and the media and the way that they're programming people into thinking a certain way about food. I mean, that's a huge undertaking. There's a pushback against that. Would you not agree?
Jayne, I'm going to come to you on this. You wrote a book that covers much of what's just been highlighted there. So your thoughts? Yeah,
I mean, you're right to state that we are up against a very massive challenge because the justifications for the plant-based diet are often, on the surface, one thing and then something else entirely. So the economic drive so in schools, for instance, a lot of the drive towards meatless Mondays and meatless Fridays and that kind of thing, and vegetarian menus, will be because it's cheaper and easier to provide that. And I've had school heads tell me that. But it's positioned as good for you, good for the planet. So what we need to start to do is to disconnect all of those motivations and to kind of expose them. It's very, very difficult to do, though, because not only do we have this these multiple motivations, which are not always transparent, driving decisions, we have multiple points of, what would I call it, misinformation, right back to our very own government guidelines about what we should be eating. Now, I spoke to Professor Tim Spector at the end of one of his talks a couple of weeks ago, and he's very firmly of the opinion that the guidelines that are currently sponsored by the NHS and by official bodies, the Eat Well plate and all of that, are about 20 years out of date as compared to the knowledge we have about what really is a healthy diet. And that Eat Well plate, which, by the way, hospitals have to follow, I think schools have to follow it too, prisons, everybody has to follow that. It is not evidence-based. It's deficient in many ways. One of them is it's starch heavy. It's about 70% starch in calorie terms. And it's also got inbuilt biases against saturated fat, for instance, which have been disproven time and time again. A study came out last week, which again, should have been the nail in the coffin for that bias, but it hasn't been. So there's a lot of work to do to undo that official picture of what a healthy diet is. And until we do that, we won't be able to make much progress in schools and hospitals because you need that official stamp of approval.
Thank you. I'm going to go right to the back. There's a few hands. I will get through them. I think, is it Andrew? Did you have your hand up? Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew Loftus, NFU. A brilliant evisceration of the global burden of disease study work, so thank you, Alice. My specific question's around processed meat. I see that creeping up on a few of the charts. I think I've got a fairly clear idea of what that means, but I don't think a lot of consumers know what is processed and what is not. A frankfurter clearly is, but is a British sausage processed? And is it the right term? Is it a helpful term? Because it's not the chopping up of something and the reforming of it that makes it unhealthy. It's the addition of other things to it. And therefore, it's them that are unhealthy and not the meat itself. So I wonder whether that term should be replaced with a better one.
Alice.
Yeah, there are issues with the classification of food, but the best that we have at the moment, I think it probably is overall the best. It's not perfect. Is the NOVA classification, which is unprocessed or minimally processed. Processed, which is really processed for the purposes of preservation, so is salted, smoked, or refrigerated and repackaged. And then ultra-processed, which is where you can barely recognize the whole food components and where there is likely to be multiple additives. Processed meats are very diverse, and in all of the scientific and medical studies, they're all lumped together. There is some evidence that processed meat in excess does cause cancers and may be linked to diabetes mellitus as well, but it's in excess and it's not a big effect. So going from a 1% to even a 2% risk of getting colon cancer in the next 10 years is actually pretty small. Whereas if you smoke cigarettes, you probably go from a 1% of getting lung cancer to a 30% over 30 years. If you smoke cigarettes, you're likely to die of a smoking-related disease. The magnitude of effect is huge. It is a problem that processed meats are all lumped in together. So ham, which is minimally salted, is alongside a chicken burger, which is filled with, or chicken nuggets, which are filled with all sorts of things in addition, and maybe only have 50% of the chicken in it. But I think what I would come back to is a balanced diet. No food by itself is bad for you. It's an excess, it's the wrong quantity. So a balanced diet that includes a wide range of foods in approximately the right proportions, and there's a lot of flexibility in it, is what is best for you.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to pick slight contention there. I was once told there is a food that's bad for you, and that's celery. Because if all you eat is celery, you burn more calories chewing the celery than you get from the celery. But we can perhaps debate that later on.
But that just proves the point. Yeah. If you eat an excess amount.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to take, there was one more question, I think, in the back row. It was at David. Perfect. And then if you could bring the microphone, David, down to Owen at the front.
Thanks. David Barton, NFU. Could I have the panel's view on lab-grown meat, and could it be commercially produced to any sort of scale? And if it was, would it challenge red meat? Thank you.
Okay, and I'm going to add one more bit to that, which is, would you consume it as an individual? Judith?
I love innovation, and particularly technical innovation, so I try most things. But I think again, it comes back to definitions, and I think we talk an interesting language. So lab-grown meat and lab-grown meat and lab-grown meat. What are those definitions? So there is meat that is biologically grown, that is identical to meat that is produced by an animal. There is lab-grown meat that is pseudo-meat that might be grown through microbiological proteins, so on and so forth. So again, we use these broad terms that mean multiple different things. Do I think we should be exploring all sorts of things? Yes, I do. I think just in the same way that, growing leafy vegetables and soft fruits in vertical farms with just aeroponics rather than soil are all things that we should be doing. However, I was going to comment on the other question, Stuart, because when I was coming here... Briefly. When I was coming here in the taxi, the driver said to me, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to the City Meat lecture." He went, "Oh." He said, "How long is that going to last?" I said, "Oh, about an hour and a half, 2 hours." And he said, "How can anyone talk about meat for that long?" and I say that because he's a consumer.
Yeah.
And sometimes we talk our own language and we get tied up in the nuances of things, when actually what consumers want is what foods can I eat, should I eat, and what foods shouldn't I eat or eat less of, and everything in moderation. And I love that saying that is if your granny doesn't recognise it as food, then it's probably not a good idea to eat it. So.
Very good. Owen.
Just a comment more than a question. If you look at any piece of the information that's been presented tonight, I would suggest you should look at the slide which charts dairy intake, red meat intake, and fish intake against healthy outcomes. In the case of dairy, it's almost a straight line. And my point is, there are wonderfully positive messages. And in answer to a question that Stuart posed to Judith, I think about the consumer before I think about anything. And I imagine that consumer asking me, what's in it for me? And I think it's very possible to answer that question if we approach it properly by saying your health, your family's health, and a healthy environment. And there are two things that I include in every presentation I make, which I think are not raised enough. And the first is that farming is one of only 2 industries in the world with the ability to store carbon as well as creating emissions. And I'm coming from a position where I think farming is really important, and that makes it much more important. And that ability to store carbon, we have proven already, is enormous. How exciting is that? And the second point is, what's the sustainable position for human health? And I think the sustainable position for human health is that prevention is always better than cure. And I think our health is our wealth. And I think if we reflect on those positions, this industry section has got a lot going for it. And a final comment. There is a narrative around all of this which says if you want to be positive for the environment, it's got to be bad for the food industry or bad for farming. I think we're missing the fact that most of our biodiversity on the planet lives in our soil. And most of our soil is taken care of by our farming industry. And if we want to promote biodiversity, the opportunity to do that through good farming is almost limitless. So I think a more positive attitude which says we can have very good environmental outcomes, very good production agriculture outcomes, very good food industry outcomes, very good biodiversity outcomes, very good environmental outcomes generally, simultaneously. Win-win, win-win.
Thank you, Owen. Look, with at least a back row full of farmers and a farmer chairman, you won't get anyone disagreeing with you on much of that. I'm going to bring in one more question. Now, from my tally here, and this is the last question, Jeff, I promise. From my tally here, there's somewhere between 80 and 90% of the questions have come from people older than me, okay? And I'm not telling anyone which of the 2 tallies they're in. So therefore, I am only going to take a question from a young person. But before I take that, I've got a question for everyone else. The question that hasn't yet been asked is the one about whose job it is to communicate what Alice has presented. It is not Alice's job to present this on behalf of the industry. She does a great job. But actually, we all have a job to talk about this, to communicate this. You know, Jayne did it brilliantly in her book. So who in this room in the last month has read a negative news article about the meat industry in a newspaper? That's not far off pretty much everyone. Who in this room has written a letter to that same newspaper in response to what that article was saying, to correct it, to balance it? 3 of you. Well done, all 3 of you, and 2 of you I'd already guessed, and I suspect I suspect if I asked Hugh, he would probably tell me he's written enough letters to cover the other 180 people in the room anyway, but we won't. So, last question. They've got to be under my age, and I'm the judge if they are. So, Bill, you're not. Yeah, Will, I'm sorry for those that I'm not going to pick on. We'll go down here, the lady in the glasses, who is definitely younger than me.
Hi, thank you very much. So I work for Sainsbury's and as a product developer, and I think at the moment there is a huge problem with conveying the right messages to customers, and increasingly more so with the buzzword of the cost of living crisis. And from what I've tried to take in tonight, there is still some mixed messages there, and it is still quite hard to work out exactly what we should be conveying to our customers and what we should be encouraging them to do, especially in the meat, fish and poultry category. And for me, at the moment, one of the main questions that I've got from that is, where money is so important, should we be encouraging customers to focus on the quality of meat that they buy from us, or the quantity of meat? Because if people can't afford to buy it, and it's going to cause, childhood problems later down the line, that feels like a responsibility on us to fix that. So which one do you think is kind of going to, longer term, make sure we're not having a negative impact on people's development?
Great question, thank you. I'm going to take that question. It's the only question I'm going to give to all the panellists. And in answering that question, can you also, any last points, brief points, I promise, Jeff, that you want to leave us with this evening? And we'll start from this end, Judith.
Yeah, really good question. I think we have to reframe the whole value for money equation. And I would like to think that that's value for calories. So think back to Alice's very first slide, when people not enough calories, people with too many calories, people with hidden hunger. The issue is the quality of those calories. So instead of pence per 100 grams, pence per 100 calories, nutrition density per 100 calories, greenhouse gases per 100 calories. And we have to show people that, and Leeds University have done some really good work on this, you can get value for calories and you can make every calorie count. So that would be my...
Thank you. Jayne?
I feel very strongly that everyone should have access to the nutrition that animal source foods and meat included provides. So it's very, very difficult as we navigate our way towards encouraging more regenerative forms of meat and the better quality meat that comes from farms that we know and that we know sequester carbon, et cetera, at the same time as enabling people to buy ordinary meat that they need to feed their families every day. I recognize that's probably the biggest challenge we have in marketing this. I think one of the ways around that to help people who are on low incomes is to stress the basket entirety of meat, eggs, dairy, all animal source foods. Eggs are usually very cheap. The issue right now is they're too cheap and farmers aren't getting any money for or making any profit on any of the eggs they sell right now, which is why we have a shortage.
Thank you, Jake.
But eggs are a great, if you can't get meat into your diet of your kids, eggs are a great way of getting that nutrition in, that quality protein, whipping up an omelet, that kind of thing. So I can't pretend to be a brand expert or a marketing and advertising expert and know how you convey those messages in store, but somehow we need to convey that animal source foods in their entirety are nutrient dense. They are not things to be feared. They are good for you. We've got to get that message out into supermarkets and everywhere else that people buy.
Well said. Thank you, Jayne. John?
Okay. I'm going to take issue with you later about eggs.
Okay, all right.
I also deal with eggs, and it's causing me extreme stress at the moment.
I
But
bet it is.
it's not as clear-cut as that. It's a very complex sector, but that aside. A brilliant question. I'm not going to answer it because I'm going to say it should be both quantity and quality, ideally. British meat is exceptionally good, high standard in terms of welfare, in terms of environment. It is good for the environment. We've seen emissions fall 15% in the last 30 years. But pork is now produced at 40% less emissions than it was 20 years ago. Dairy, likewise, so much more efficient now. I'm also going to say that consumption at the moment, the latest figures, is that meat consumption has fallen by about 4 to 5%. So cost of living is having an impact. We've got to find a way of giving people that varied diet, showing them different ways of using different types of meat. It doesn't have to be a top quality steak, although that is lovely, but you can do things with mince. Poultry, pork, there's such a variety of meats on offer. I think we just have to do our best to educate the consumer more. It's back to that word education again, and that's the one I'm going to take away, is I think government probably can do a bit more about how we educate the consumer. I think you as an industry have definitely got a role to play in educating and engaging with the community.
Thank you, John. And Alice, what one message do you want to leave everyone with?
I absolutely agree about nutrient density. I think we should be thinking about what is going to make the livestock industry even more sustainable. The facts are that the supermarket basket, actually over the last 50 years, the footprint of emissions, for emissions certainly, has halved because of efficiencies. We need to speed that up so that the next halving occurs even quicker. And the farmers and the food industry that are on that pathway need to be rewarded. So I think taking away promotion and taking away advertisement from all livestock products is completely wrong. You need to promote those that are nutrient dense, high quality, and are on a pathway to sustainability. Aren't at zero as yet, but are on a pathway and are demonstrated to be heading in that direction, because that'll be good for the whole world.
Thank you, Alice. So I'm going to draw things to a conclusion. The clerk gave me an extra 10 minutes when I asked him earlier how far can I overrun, and I've taken half an hour, so apologies for that. But I think we could probably take another half an hour if we wanted to, but don't worry, I won't. It's been a fantastic evening. I think building particularly on last year's lecture, where we looked very much at the environmental aspects of much of what you said, Owen, and you just touched on at the end, Alice. But for anyone who doesn't think this is a real threat, there was a quote from a UK chief scientist, I think 10 years ago. I can't remember the exact date. And you touched on cigarettes, Alice. And his quote to his ministers at the time, to cabinet at the time, was, "We need to make eating a steak as socially unacceptable as smoking." And it pretty much went unchallenged at the time. And it is the people in this room that can challenge some of this better than anyone. So when next year I ask how many people have responded to those negative articles, how many people have spoken in schools, how many people have taken this message to their own community, whether it be the local WI, whether it be the local school group, whether it be the local PTA, I would like to see a far larger number of hands go up. But very finally from me, can I give an enormous thank you, first of all, to our panelists. We didn't have enough time to talk about everything, we never do. But to John, to Jayne, and to Judith, can I thank you enormously for joining us. Judith and I have done, I cannot remember how many of these panels together, and they are always phenomenally enjoyable, and we always gain a lot from them, or I do anyway. You probably don't gain a lot from me, I'm sure. But most of all, on behalf of all of us, and can we give her a huge round of applause, not only for what she has presented this evening, but the fact that she presents this day in, day out, on behalf of true science, but also on behalf of a very grateful meat industry, livestock industry, and ultimately for consumers. Can we all please thank our panel and Professor Alice Stanton. And with that, can I reiterate what the clerk said earlier, and I hope I'm not going to get this wrong. Anyone on this side of the room, please go to the ground floor and get some food. You're then allowed to walk upstairs with the food. Anyone on the right-hand side, please go down one floor and gather your food there. That way everyone can get served relatively quickly, albeit because of me half an hour later than you were supposed to. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for supporting us. And I am sure the committee are already busy thinking about what they will put in place for next year. So thank you all very much.